welcome everyone to our nearly annual research briefing. Great to see some faces in the crowd, familiar faces I haven't seen for a bit, and great to see a number of folks online as well. We'll start by sort of thanking the people who have made this possible. Special thanks to the Resources Legacy Fund, Campbell Foundation, Department of Cannabis Control, Social Science Matrix, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, UC Berkeley, UCNR, all who have contributed to making our research and the center's work possible. I'm Van Butsic. I'm one of the co-directors of the center, and I'm just going to give a real brief introduction to what we do here. Everybody in this room knows about cannabis. In California, cannabis is sort of defined by its THC levels. These THC levels have had massive social implications. It's a drug. According to the federal government, high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use and treatment. Of course, we know this is probably untrue and also is something that's changing over time, society's view on this. It's a medicine. For many people, it's an important medicine and an important part of their daily life and their wellness and well-being. It's a cash crop. The value, this might be a little bit high. These slides I think we made in the fall for a different introduction, and times change. That's partly what we're going to talk about today for sure. But it's a cash crop in California for sure. It's a major importance to rural livelihoods in the state. So many parts of the state, this is a major economic driver. It's a source of government revenue, $4 billion to the state since 2018, plus county and municipal taxes on cultivation and distribution. It's a source of crime. We know that illicit farms are still a problem throughout the state, and there's still a strong black market with a real criminal component. We also know it's an environmental threat in certain cases, right? So we have seen these news articles, we've seen the reports where cultivation has led to negative environmental consequences. And it's also potentially a model of agricultural sustainability. So small-scale agricultural production and sustainability-oriented process have been part of growing cannabis in California for years and years. So it's a very complex subject to study, and that's why we exist. So the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center, we promote interdisciplinary scholarship on the social, environmental dimensions of cannabis production and on cannabis policy. So I think the real key about the work that we do within the center is all of the complexities around cannabis. We try to embrace that and study it from as many angles as possible. And we try to use our research to drive good policy and good outcomes for people and for nature. We have a big team of people who are working on this. This probably is missing some people, but our team continues to grow. I feel like one of the things I'm most proud about in the research we've done is how many people we've worked with, how many people have become cannabis scholars by working through our center here. And you're going to hear from a number of these folks today. All right, today's program is going to be broken pretty much into two parts. We're going to have the first part, which is going to be our virtual presentations. We're going to have 5 speakers in the first part. We're going to have a Q&A that Ted Grantham's going to moderate, so we'll take questions from the audience. Then we're going to have a quick break. You can grab a snack, relax for a moment. Then we're going to come back and we're going to have in-person presentations, a quick Q&A with that group as well. And then ideally, if we all stay on time, which I know academics always do when giving a public presentation, we'll be able to go outside and enjoy a beer or a glass of wine together and have some great conversations about the research we're doing, about next steps, what you guys would love to see us do research on, how cannabis is impacting your life, what questions you have about cannabis that you think we should be working on. We look forward to having those conversations. So with that, I think we're going to jump right into our first program, and this is the effects and efficacy of local cannabis bans. And this is going to be Margiana and Michael. So take it away.
Thanks everyone for being there. Sorry we can't join in person. My name is Dr. Margiana Petersen-Rockney.
And I'm Dr. Michael Polson.
And today we're going to be talking about our DCC funded research on cannabis bans, local control, and the effects and efficacy of Proposition 64. And Christy Getz is also involved in this project and can't be here today.
Since Proposition 215 passed in 1996, the issue of local control has been central to debates, court decisions, and policy development in California. Under Prop 64 in 2016, cities and counties were granted a high degree of authority to determine if and how cannabis cultivation could occur. Now, nearly 70% of these local jurisdictions have banned cultivation, making bans the most common cannabis cultivation policy in California. So while a majority of state voters approved Prop 64, a majority of residents now live in jurisdictions with no pathway to grow cannabis for legal markets.
And this project asked, what are the causes and effects of local level cannabis cultivation bans? To answer this, we conducted in-depth ethnographic case studies that included interviews and observations with over 150 people in 4 diverse ban counties: Siskiyou, Napa, Yuba, and San Bernardino.
We have several preliminary findings that we are going to briefly summarize here. First, different jurisdictions implement bans in different ways. Some take a softer approach, often led by code enforcement and consisting of warnings, abatement notices, and compliance periods. Others take a stricter or enforcement-first approach, usually led by the sheriff and consisting of aggressive actions like raids and immediate high fines. In general, softer enforcement entails a pedagogical approach aimed at educating unregulated cultivators, reacting to existing issues, and reducing harmful outcomes, while stricter enforcement seeks to proactively eradicate cultivation and intensify consequences for cultivators and those that aid them.
Second, stricter approaches can succeed in the short term at reducing cultivation, but their long-term success is doubtful. Strict enforcement in one jurisdiction often pushes cultivation to other jurisdictions. And strict enforcement also pushes people to cultivate in more remote and ecologically sensitive locations, and with more intensive methods to accelerate cultivation cycles prior to enforcement actions.
And third, contrary to some expectations, softer, more lenient approaches led by code enforcement can be effective at limiting the scale and negative impacts of illicit cultivation in the long term. Softer approaches can foster norms among cultivators around things like garden size, water use, and neighborly behaviors.
Fourth, cultivation bans require significant public resources. Low revenue in rural counties often don't have the capacity to develop permitting programs. Yet bans, which are the go-to option in the absence of regulatory programs, carry significant costs and often take resources away from other enforcement and policy priorities.
Fifth, bans can narrow policy objectives to eradication and elimination of cultivation rather than remediation. Sometimes enforcement actually worsens environmental conditions. This photo here shows a grow site that had been raided nearly 2 years previously. The trash and debris left after a raid can pose considerable environmental harm.
Sixth, bans limit the toolbox of options available to address cultivation issues. Banning cultivation generally doesn't stop cultivation, just as the drug war did not stop it. Instead, bans just stop the ability to regulate cultivation for socially and environmentally desirable outcomes.
Seventh, bans raise significant concerns over social equity. They exclude poorer cultivators who cannot move elsewhere to pursue licensing. They often produce conflictive oppositional dynamics within communities, and correlatively, they negatively affect populations with less access to information, who are minoritized, or have been impacted by the war on drugs.
Eighth, Proposition 64 was clear that California residents should be able to grow 6 plants for their own use and access medical cannabis. And we found that stringent compliance requirements and expensive fees impose a de facto ban on personal and medical cultivation in many places.
Our findings suggest several policy recommendations. First, we recommend small-scale exceptions to local bans. This could include reactivation of medical collective allowances or a smaller scale cultivation program administered at the state level that would reduce regulatory burdens on localities and lower barriers for small scale cultivators.
Second, reform local enforcement approaches. This means pushing enforcement at local and state levels to approach unlicensed cultivation as a civil, not criminal matter. This means educating farmers, implementing abatement periods, limiting fine structures, and utilizing punitive enforcement only as an option of last resort. While code enforcement agencies are often better suited to this approach, the key is not which agency leads, but that enforcement-first approaches are replaced by a more educational, non-punitive approach that treats unlicensed cultivators as civic, not criminal actors.
Third, redirect state agencies on cooperation with banned counties. Currently, the state prohibits support to law enforcement in banned jurisdictions, yet those jurisdictions commonly enlist state agencies like CDFW in enforcement efforts. Instead, state enforcement resources could be redirected toward remediation and linked to local environmental evaluation and mitigation plans in banned counties, just like permit counties do.
Fourth, we recommend a state commission to review local level ban enforcement to ensure fairness, medical and personal access, and reduce legal risks for local governments. This commission could also provide consistent public messaging and statewide training for state and local agency and law enforcement staff around the rights of personal and medical cultivators.
In summary, we found that local level bans rarely achieve their stated goals of reducing cultivation in an enduring way. And when they do, it's with considerable social and environmental costs. Today, we have described just some of the ways these issues can be addressed, and we hope our research can continue to aid more equitable, sustainable solutions for the state of California and beyond.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Michael Polson.
And I'm Dr. Ann Laudati.
Today, we're going to be sharing findings and recommendations from a Department of Cannabis Control funded project entitled Transformation of Unregulated Cannabis Cultivation Since Legalization, a study conducted with Dr. Nathan Sayre in the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley.
This project was centered around three overarching research questions. One, how has California's unlicensed cannabis cultivation sector transformed since legalization? Two, what conditions enable unlicensed cultivators to transition to the licensed sector? And third, if cultivators are not transitioning, why?
We answered these questions with qualitative methods that included 15 months of total fieldwork between the two of us, interviews and observations with multiple stakeholders, and significant secondary research.
Today, we are discussing work we conducted throughout the state in three primary regions in the North Coast Emerald Triangle area, the Sierra Foothills, and the Inland Empire. These regions were selected to gain a statewide perspective on the cultivation sector as it has differentially developed across California's varied landscapes.
In the course of our research, we came to focus on 3 points of investigation, the first of which is existing unlicensed dynamics. That is, how unlicensed cultivators are accessing the market, perceiving and responding to enforcement pressures, modifying cultivation techniques, navigating social relationships with neighbors, and so on.
A primary finding was that markets for unlicensed product have become less lucrative and more constricted. This can be attributed to several intersecting factors: the decline of out-of-state markets, an influx of new out-of-state product from legalizing states, and significant overproduction for numerous reasons we can discuss in our Q&A. These factors have translated into plummeting wholesale prices that are frequently below the cost of production, leading many unlicensed cultivators to exit the market entirely.
We also found that there is uneven access to supply chains and markets. While prohibition necessitated cultivation in remote locales, legalization encourages cultivation in areas closer to consumers and distribution hubs for out-of-state shipment.
There are two primary responses we saw to these stressors and market transformations. Many are unable to adjust for numerous reasons, ranging from familial pressures to disappeared savings to depression. This results in their exit from the commercial market altogether and a search for employment in areas with few formal jobs and with a CV that is sparse and difficult to transfer into other industries.
Others are able to adjust to the shifting conditions by hanging on to niche and personally developed distribution circuits, market strategies like cutting production costs, often through greater self-exploitation, developing innovative products, launching new marketing techniques through social media and unlicensed sesh markets, and finally, avoiding detection and enforcement by either hiding more effectively or cultivating in ways less likely to trip the wire of enforcement, for instance, avoiding water diversion or running noisy generators.
Whether persisting in or exiting the unlicensed market, we saw a population under a significant amount of stress. whether it be from dwindling finances to mental health challenges to the loss of meaning entailed in lost livelihoods.
The second arena of findings centered on the connections and disconnections between licensed and unlicensed markets, meaning the ways that these markets are developing separately and with their own distinct dynamics, some of which we've just mentioned, as well as the various kinds of way that both markets depend on one another.
The unlicensed and licensed markets are interdependent in three salient ways. First, there has been a significant transfer of wealth from the prohibited to the legal market. This wealth provided the basis for people to go legal as they transferred savings to the state and ancillary service providers, from consultants to construction companies. At the time of our study, nearly every person had depleted their pre-legalization savings.
Second, as prices fluctuate and various supply chain problems arise, there is significant movement of product between both markets. This traffic has been critical for licensed cultivators to stay operational and to bear the significant cost burdens of licensed markets.
Third, there's a flow of expertise and labor between both markets. The licensed cultivation sector has relied on and extracted knowledge from unlicensed operators. Also, informal workers are commonly brought into legal operations to avoid high compliance costs. All this amounts to a dependence on the legal market on the resources and outlets of the unlicensed market.
Finally, our third area of investigation centered on regulatory and other barriers to becoming licensed.
Our research confirms prior research showing the various regulatory challenges that face cultivators, including high financial costs, administrative burdens, and psychological barriers to creating a new relationship with a government that had previously criminalized farmers.
These challenges to becoming licensed have led to serious concerns among cultivators, licensed and unlicensed alike, about the fairness of the legalization process, an acute attention to instances of corruption, a perception based in experience and observation that regulation and enforcement can be punitive against both licensed and unlicensed cultivators, and finally, a regulatory system where bans are prevalent and lawsuits seeking to restrict cultivation abound. All these factors, particularly the latter, swell the ranks of unlicensed cultivators.
In our interim report, we detail 17 recommendations that flow from these findings, and we've organized them into three categories and cover them in brief today. First, the negative fallout of legalization for cultivators and their communities should be addressed. This could include supports to enhance economic outcomes for those unable to transition to legal markets, as well as community-based initiatives to bolster social service provision.
Second, the licensed market needs to be stabilized and expanded, particularly for smaller, more remote, and socially marginalized cultivators. This could include measures that allow fallowing, provide more flexibility and changes to license types.
Third, regulatory systems could be reformed to make legal cultivation economically and administratively feasible for all cultivators. This could include the administration of CEQA by the state and not by counties, and the direct, unmediated financial administrative support of farmers by the state during this difficult period of transition.
Our findings and recommendations are, of course, still in formation, and we look forward to discussing them with you all today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher Dillis. I am a researcher here at UC Berkeley in the Cannabis Research Center. And I'm going to be sharing with you today some of the ongoing work we're doing with regards to cannabis and wildfire. So some of this may be a little familiar to people who have been participating in previous seminars, but we're going to be adding some results from some of the new work we've been doing as well. Okay. So really 2020 was the year that I think captured everybody's attention with this. It certainly grabbed a lot of headlines, and it's the year we started looking to answer some questions with data. And so one of the first questions we wanted to ask was, is cannabis different than all other forms of agriculture in California in terms of its risk? It's the threat of wildfire. And so we compared cannabis to grapes and pasture and other forms of crop. There's all other crops in general, on several metrics. And the one I'm showing here is it's the fire hazard severity metric that's developed by CAL FIRE. So it takes into account, terrain and fuel load, fire weather, and other things into like a composite score that's mapped out in California. And you can see based on the locations of these different farm types, cannabis farms are more often, a higher proportion of them are located in areas that are very high or high fire hazard severity zones compared to anything else in a pretty pretty noticeable way, to say the least. So we also wanted to ask, looking forward into the future, how do these patterns look between cannabis and other crops? And so what we did was we used some wildfire simulation data from California's fourth climate assessment. And that allowed us to sort of map these burn patterns across the landscape. So in a given area, are we expecting new and intensifying hotspots or other forms of hotspots? And so those hotspots are all in the red, orange, and yellow colors here. And you can see the cannabis is just far and away more vulnerable under climate change than any of these other crop types as well. So I think we definitely answered that cannabis is deserving of special attention. And I think that helped us to get funding from the DCC to conduct a study on the actual impacts of wildfire. So we were able to collect about 200 responses to our survey that gave us good data on crop impacts from wildfire smoke, some commonly used mitigation techniques that cannabis farmers are using, and then some reported operational disruptions as a result of wildfire. And so to get at impacts first, what we wanted to do was take the reported impacts and then use those to make estimates for all licensed cannabis statewide. And so what we did was we created a model that predicted impacts based on distance to wildfire and the number of days in the flowering period spent underneath a thick smoke plume. And so as you can see, applying these to all statewide mixed light and outdoor licenses, 2020 and 2021 were both pretty severe years in terms of projected crop losses. In 2020 specifically, almost a fifth if we're going with the higher range of our estimates, and I'll be happy to talk about how we came up with this range. But the other thing I wanted to note was that locally in particular counties, and especially in Northern California, there were particularly bad years. The one that stands out above all others was Trinity in 2021, where our estimates were near 50% production loss as a result of wildfire. So these sorts of statewide but also very severe localized events are definitely very concerning. And so you'll recall from the survey, we also got data on mitigation techniques that farmers are using, and interestingly, washing the growing crops, whether that's blowing them off or washing them with water, was the most effective, or is viewed as the most effective mitigation technique by farmers. And this is relative to just simply covering them or using automatic irrigation or washing harvested crops. And the other finding to note here is that evacuations were common and they were pretty disruptive. So 70% of respondents reported having an evacuation at some point, and 50% losing site access for some point during the 4-year study period. So the 4-year study period was 2018 through 2021. So okay, and then just to wrap up with our well, I don't say solutions, but some of the approaches that I think need to happen, or that we think need to happen. One of them is just getting agricultural passes into the hands of cannabis farmers. Now, some counties have already done this, and that's fantastic. I think Mendocino and Humboldt and Sonoma maybe also, and maybe a few others have been able to do this already. But this is a statewide issue for wildfire impacts to cannabis, and so just really trying to get coverage statewide, whether or not this is something that the state could lead something like this, or at the very least sort of promote and sanction it. And then finally, it would be very helpful to have a mechanism by which farmers could report these wildfire crop related losses, wildfire related crop losses, excuse me. Just because having better spatial coverage and resolution to the data would really allow us to give more sophisticated estimates of production loss, and this would really go a long way to help raise awareness for the issue, but also to help come up with meaningful ways to mitigate some of these losses, perhaps, especially given the issues with getting insurance for wildfire or for anything for cannabis. So with that, I will end and have you take any questions. I believe the questions will be after these talks, though. Okay, so thanks for listening, and I'll talk later.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to be presenting about our work looking at wildlife and cannabis, so specifically our DCC-funded project, Understanding and Reducing Cannabis-Associated Light and Noise Disturbance on Wildlife. I'm Phoebe Parker-Shames. I am a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley, and the PIs for this project are Justin Bracheres, Mary Power, and Pete Aboyski. Our other co-authors are Kendall Calhoun, Christopher Schell, Chelsea Andriozzi, and Allison Smith. So I'm going to start by just sort of explaining a little bit about why we decided this project was so important. So my team and I have been researching wildlife responses to cannabis farms, and we realized that there are a lot of different potential ways for wildlife to interact both positively and negatively with cannabis farms. There's clearing, fencing, greenhouses that sometimes might have lights running, drying barns with fans, there's a lot of people, and there's a wide variation in farming practices across farms. So not all of the farms will have the same impacts. So if we want to know how might specific practices on cannabis farms affect local wildlife, and secondarily, how we mitigate those impacts, then we need to simplify this picture and just focus on one or two pathways. So in this case, we are focusing in on light and sound using field experiments to mimic the light and noise produced by cannabis farming in a controlled field experiment, and then monitoring wildlife around these disturbance sources at different distances. So the project as a whole is an experimental study of how wildlife respond to light and sound. Again, we're mimicking cannabis conditions, but this particular research is actually not conducted on cannabis farms. Our goals are to summarize wildlife responses to light and sound disturbances, identify sensitive species or groups, and identify distance thresholds. So this is all sort of designed to help landowners, cannabis farmers, and regulators identify sort of useful information about the ways in which farms may impact local wildlife, and then therefore specific things that you could do to mitigate that. So what distance, setbacks do we need? What is sort of a sound decibel threshold that we need to make to reduce impacts? Are there specific species that we might be worried about in our local area? That sort of thing. And our project is all in Mendocino County. So we're working at Angelo Coast Range Reserve and Hopland Research and Extension Center. You can see them located on the map at the right. So this is an example of some of our light and speaker setup at Angelo and Hopland. So at Angelo, we have sort of this 45 watt white light setup. And at Hopland, we have a full spectrum, higher wattage LED light, a little bit more representative for larger industrial scale mixed light. So we sort of covering different styles of cultivation in each of these areas, and we have 3 sites each at Angelo and Hopland, and we're using what's called a BACI design, or a before-after control impact design. So each site is its own control, alternating with treatment and control periods. And then we surround these treatment sources with a variety of monitoring equipment. So we use camera traps to monitor medium to large mammals, sticky traps and also bucket traps for flying insects, acoustic monitors for birds and bats, and then something called a drift fence here on the right, in which wildlife, small mammals, so small mammals and reptiles walking along landscape, come in contact with the fence, which then funnels them under that bucket that you see on the end, which actually has a camera placed on it facing the ground. And from that, we get images of animals. So I've got some examples of some of those. These are some of the small mammals that we get on these cameras. And we also get reptiles as well. And then this is in addition to, again, those other monitoring equipment. So for example, the large mammal cameras, we get a lot of photos of wildlife on that. So we take these photos and the acoustic files, we identify the species that are present in them, and then we analyze the data. And our analyses are still ongoing. We're going to be wrapping up this summer. So hopefully soon we will have more results to share. But in the meantime, I'll just give a few preliminary results. So far we have found no consistent community trends. So all animals as a whole are not behaving consistently. Not everything's avoiding or being attracted to these disturbance sources. Some species of large mammals like deer and coyotes are avoiding, specifically in that they are reducing their activity rates at close distances to the light sources. We also see reduced small mammal and reptile richness, so just the number of species that we actually detect with the sound and light disturbances. Insect responses, oh, sorry, this is my cat coming to say hi. Insect responses are site-specific, and depending on the site, some species are either attracted or deterred, mostly within that 50-meter distance. And then we detect fewer species of bats on nights with light or sound. And then most bird species are decreasing their calling rates with light or sound, and that affects, we tend to still see it out to 200 meters for the species that we've looked at, but take the bird data with a little bit of a grain of salt because we haven't actually verified the calls. And as we continue these analyses, we expect to see individual species or species groupings respond differently. And I just want to close with emphasizing that these results, while really important and relevant for cannabis, are also going to be useful for informing impacts much more broadly on ecosystems. We live in a world that is increasingly being noisy and bright. And so we're hoping that this research on cannabis actually helps us understand our broad ecosystem impacts. And with that, I will say thank you. You can find my contact information on the top of the slide. Thanks to my co-authors, our funders, and all of the many undergraduates who have been helping out on this research project.
All right, hi everybody. I'm Ted Grantham. I'm one of the other co-directors of the Cannabis Research Center. So we're going to take about 10 minutes to take questions on any of the presentations that we just heard. Hopefully we'll figure out a way to monitor the Zoom as well. But maybe to get started, does anyone from the audience have any questions for any of our presenters? They should all be on Zoom and can help to address them. Elijah.
I was just curious with my last presentation, why you all chose to focus on mimicking cannabis production as opposed to just going to existing cannabis farms.
Thanks for the question. So this is sort of work that is building off some existing research that was conducted on cannabis farms. And so sort of what I was trying to highlight at the beginning is there's so much going on active cannabis farms that we really wanted to specifically isolate certain mechanisms and pathways, which I think is really important for designing regulations and best management practices, because we need to know specifically what's the impact of certain production practices so that we can make, advisements about the use of things like noise-making generators or fans or specific types of light. What buffer distances do we need from sensitive habitats? Are there sensitive species in an area that might be specifically impacted by these practices? So we tried for this particular research to get really specific, and for that we really needed the field experiments where we could isolate those specific sources away from the rest of the potential pathways happening on a cannabis farm. But we have actual data from cannabis farms as well to try to help us understand and contextualize these experimental results as well.
Yeah, Seth.
For Michael and Margiana, I was wondering how you went about conducting your interviews. Was it snowball sampling, or did you have a list of cultivators that you were already in contact with?
Yeah, we used a snowball sampling method, which included starting with many different points, and then asking people who they knew, who we should be in contact with. But I want to emphasize that we started with many different points because we were talking to people in a variety of positions and from various sets of perspectives. And we used a purposive sampling frame to try to capture that, trying to talk to as many people coming from as many different experiences and perspectives and backgrounds as possible.
I guess this is a question primarily for the social scientists, but I always get the feeling when talking to people in policy and people in the industry that things are changing, just at lightning speed all the time. And I'm curious, you've been working on these projects for about 2 years, and have you seen changes in those 2 years where you think some of the findings you found 18 months ago no longer hold, or do you think the research is able to keep up with the pace of change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the big factors in that regard is just the market trends, right? I mean, the prices are going up, prices are going down, all kinds of people are figuring out different adaptive mechanisms to navigate those kinds of changes. So yeah, I think across both projects, we had to handle that in various ways of knowing that these, our work, of course, is at one level to describe what's actually happening, but then through that begin to ferret out, what is it? What are the dynamics underlying these? What are the underlying kind of social processes? What are the power dynamics? What are the blocks in terms of barriers to regulation, to kind of the fundamental questions about why people stay, for instance, in unlicensed markets? And those kinds of dynamics, I don't think, they're responsive certainly to the situations as they're developing around the market, but they belie a kind of more enduring kind of dynamics that was really where we tried to focus our findings and our writing around. Still doing that work, yeah.
And I'll just add that I think this is an especially exciting place to do research because these things are unfolding, new policy dynamics are unfolding, market trends, et cetera, in real time. And so we're able to see this historic perspective, even if the history that we're looking at isn't very long. And that can really help us see how these dynamics compare in different contexts and over time.
Whoever thinks it's relevant to their work. Since California has moved towards legalization, several other states have followed. And I'm just curious for the researchers, how much interaction you have with researchers in other states, and recognizing that there's a lot of uniqueness to California's situation. Just curious how much interaction there is in the research community around cannabis issues, state to state.
Yeah, so a lot of my research has actually been done in Southern Oregon as well. Those are sort of cultivating communities that are really similar. So I mainly work in Southern Oregon. It's very similar to a lot of the dynamics in Northern California. And I think that's partly because of the proximity. They're very close in space. They're also very close in legalization. Oregon legalized, I think, just a year before California did. And there's also a lot of shared sort of production practices, knowledge, labor, plants that go back and forth between the two. So there's a lot of strong linkages between the industries, particularly in Southern Oregon and Northern California. Yeah, I personally would love to engage more with folks sort of up and down the West Coast. Some of the dynamics happening in some of the other states is some parts of it are more or less applicable to the work happening in California, partially because some of the industries in other states are much more predominated with indoor as opposed to outdoor.
I think the enormity of what the Department of Cannabis Control and Prop 64 really provided for the research community in the last several years with this program that, it's $10 million a year dedicated towards research. And that is really an unparalleled amount of money in a lot of ways, not necessarily in total research done around cannabis, for instance, but for sure, it is a unique contribution to research that's coming from a jurisdiction, a government that has legalized cannabis. So I think the significance of some of this research that's being done currently in California is that it's not being done with the same kind of mandates that have really shaped and crafted cannabis research for the last 50 years, not only in the US, but around the world. So those dynamics are changing, I think, and it's exciting to be part of this cohort. We do have the website, and we try to put up and make available all of our research publicly accessible. And we get inquiries from not only across the US, but around the world too, because sometimes we forget, we get so caught up in the legalization and cannabis policies and dynamics in the US that we forget that this is actually a globally evolving process right now, and that many other governments are trying to figure these questions out. And so California, as the largest, jurisdiction in the world, even larger than Canada, that has legalized cannabis, that these are the significance of what California has to offer, I think, is really unparalleled. So it's exciting to be part of this kind of research endeavor.
Thanks, Michael. Looks like we have a few questions in the chat. There was one question about the availability of these presentations, and we are going to post these presentations and our slides on our website. So these will be made available to a broader audience. There's a question here directed towards you, Chris, on your thoughts on the impacts of fire insurance not being available to this industry. Could you elaborate on that point that you mentioned in your presentation?
We've heard that insurance is unavailable, but in our survey, we actually had a few respondents say that they did have fire insurance. We were not really, there's some follow-up there to see exactly what that looks like. The other thing I would say is in doing this work, we sort of really became aware with how unaffordable fire insurance and unavailable fire insurance is for a lot of just rural landowners in general. So it seems like the wildfire insurance cannabis nexus is one thing, but it's not unique to cannabis. But what is unique is that there's just a lack of insurance, crop insurance that other farmers of other types of crops enjoy. And so part of our I guess what do we call that document that we put out? The research briefing. One of our main themes was that cannabis just needs to be treated more as an agricultural crop, and I think this falls under the umbrella of that argument. So as far as what to do specifically, I guess I'm at a loss for immediate quick solutions. Does anybody else have ideas?
No, I would just say it seems like there's a role for the state to potentially step in and fill that need for crop insurance that the federal government offers to other crops. So we have another question here about the wildlife study, Phoebe. There's a question about, was the last study on light and sound pollution simulating indoor grow sites? I'm a bit confused why there would be nighttime light pollution on an outdoor cultivation site. Do you want to address that question?
Obviously, there's a lot of different styles of cultivation out there. So this particular study is really looking at the style of like greenhouse and mixed light outdoor production. So a lot of folks, especially with the increasing pressures of the markets in order to make multiple harvests in a year, people are relying on using lights to help with that grow process. And even though in some places, and I think in most places, they are supposed to keep those greenhouses covered, the costs of doing so, of tarping and untarping, can often be really prohibitive. So many people are not really able to keep up with that schedule. And also, we don't necessarily know what the impacts of, using the tarping or not using the tarping, the impacts of that light on the surrounding area are. So the focus for this is not indoor. It is for the mixed light greenhouse outdoor production. But we do have a couple different types of lights that are used, generally with different kind of scale of production, sort of smaller scale and larger scale types of lights.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, so a good time to we'll take a short break then, 10 minutes, and then we're going to resume with talks before our social hour. Thanks.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for being here in person and for everyone who's tuning in online. My name is Joanna Hossack, and I'm joined today with my colleagues, Haley de Genova and Daniel Froehlich. The PIs on this study are Eric Bieber and Moira O'Neill. They couldn't be here today, but we're all very excited to share our research about the local regulation of commercial cannabis cultivation in California. So to set the stage, what we're looking at and examining is the extent to which the local regulation of cultivation is impacting the goals of Prop 64. Specifically, the intent of Prop 64 to take cultivation out of the hands of the illegal market and bring it under a regulatory structure that protects public health, public safety, and the environment. So to do that, we're looking at the questions of how are local governments using their land use powers to regulate and permit cannabis cultivation, including conducting environmental review? What are the barriers to entry at the local and state level and the combination of those two? And what are the potential solutions to ease the regulatory process while also maintaining rigorous public health, public safety, and environmental standards? So our research utilizes a mixed methods case study approach where we analyzed 11 counties' zoning and planning code, and then we tested that against actual permit data, including land use entitlements and business licenses. So we are looking at 11 counties that were chosen because they are where the most cannabis cultivation is occurring. And that includes the Emerald Triangle, which is a historic legacy producing region, as well as 8 counties that have an emerging cannabis cultivation industry. The first step in our process was to draft extensive planning code summaries, where we looked at various source documents, starting with the planning and zoning code and public hearings, and then expanding upon that by looking at policy documents provided by counties, including FAQs, actual application materials. We also looked at litigation against county cannabis programs and grand jury investigations. Then we rounded that out by looking at trade association publications and news articles. So once we did that legal research, we drafted planning code summaries that look at the law as written on the books and then how it's applied in practice, which is not always clear from the written word. And we looked at how each county treats environmental review. And then once we had a planning code summary for each county, we did a comparative analysis looking at each county and what their similarities were, what their differences were, and what trends were. So I'm going to hand it over to Haley to talk about some of the preliminary findings from our planning code summaries.
All right, does this work? So some of the earliest findings that began to emerge from our report was through the examination of, as Joanna said, just looking at the ordinances as they were written. And we first came to realize that counties were applying really stringent requirements on cultivators, and that some of these ordinances were very long and onerous. Second, when we did our comparative analysis of the counties, we found that there was very little uniformity in the local regulations and how they define key terms. And these counties were not just defining key terms differently, but they were also defining these terms differently than how the state defined them. So third, as we started to look at how the codes were actually applied, we found that the ordinances in many counties were consistently being amended, updated, and in some cases even completely repealed and replaced, which obviously would pose a huge barrier for compliance to cultivators. And so finally, findings regarding environmental review and CEQA compliances also emerged during this stage. And we discovered both that there's a lot of variability in CEQA review pathways across counties, and that if counties adopted local ministerial permitting processes rather than discretionary permitting procedures, those ordinances were often incompatible with the environmental review requirements imposed by the state.
So with the planning code summaries and the legal research serving as our guide for the local regulations, the next component of our methodological approach is to construct a micro-level observation census database of commercial cannabis cultivation projects that reached full local approval between 2018 and 2020. So we gathered approval documents for our observations through public portals and from public records requests. And from these public records, we constructed a database with two main components. So across the top of my diagram here was collection and coding of the project data. So we coded for locational and land use and zoning information, general project characteristics such as canopy size, water source, etc. The local land use review process that the observation actually had to undergo in order to reach full local approval, and then the environmental determinations made for the project under CEQA. This allows us to quantify these processes and calculate timeframes to approval on the local level again. The second component of this quantitative work involved the terms and conditions of approval. So we qualitatively coded the TCOA with the jurisdictions imposed on the approved projects. And this allows us to evaluate what aspects of and how jurisdictions regulate these projects and the stringency of the review process. And so we will integrate these two components with GIS analysis and state provided data sets in order to consider how observations with different characteristics navigate local approval processes within and across jurisdictions. And so I'm just going to share a few of our preliminary analyses that connect directly to some of the things that Haley and Joanna spoke to. And I just emphasize that this is preliminary, very rough, very messy. So we ask that you don't cite or distribute this in a definitive way, but this sort of gives you a rough sense of the direction that we're going in. So we see a wide variability in the number of observations that are actually approved across the jurisdictions within our time frame. With Humboldt County contributing nearly 3/4 of the observations that have successfully gone through the local pipeline. And also we see a wide variability in the timeframes to approval across jurisdictions. So again, Humboldt has the largest mean time frame, but it's also the jurisdiction getting the most projects through the pipeline, right? By contrast, for example, Monterey County has a fairly similar time frame, but we've only identified 4 fully compliant projects within our 3-year time span. And in most jurisdictions where the data is available, when we look at the pre-existing versus new distinction here, we're seeing that the pre-existing cultivators are facing longer approval timeframes on average than new cultivators. I think this is something that we've seen anecdotally, but we crunch the numbers and we're seeing it quantitatively also. Across all jurisdictions in the aggregate, the pre-existing cultivators on average are seeing approval timeframes that are over 60% longer than new cultivators. That becomes a little more modest when we disaggregate for the jurisdictions, but the pattern still holds true for most of them. And then to talk a little bit about CEQA, the manner in which jurisdictions apply environmental review under CEQA to these projects also varies greatly. This is true not only across jurisdictions, which you see from the pie chart, but also within jurisdictions themselves, where different projects and different observations have different CEQA pathways applied to them. And of course, as you might expect, that the CEQA determination that is made for a project can also affect the timeframes. So I'm taking Lake County, San Luis Obispo, and Sonoma counties just as examples that share a comparable land use review process and also have cultivation sites that are similar in scale. So we can see that observations with a project-specific CEQA document, like a mitigated negative declaration, they're seeing longer approval timeframes than projects that have been applied with a less onerous environmental review. So just to conclude, I just want to summarize our next steps over the next few months. We're going to continue to clean, integrate, analyze, and visualize our data. We'll continue updating our planning code summaries to account for all the changes that have happened since our interim report last summer. And then we'll use our empirical results to continue crafting our policy recommendations for local best practices and for state regulations. So we thank you. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you to all of my student researchers who are here today. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Sorgen. I'm a postdoc in ESPM and I'm going to pass it to Seth.
Hi, everybody. My name's Seth LaRosa. I'm a graduate student in ESPM and a researcher for the Cannabis Research Center. So our project looked at how cannabis permitting was impacting tribal sovereignty across the state. A little bit of background. I think we've covered a lot of this already, but Prop 64 brought about legal cannabis to the entire state of California, but it was sort of set up differentially on a county by county basis. Also important in our project is the understanding that the land of California, and really all land in North America, perhaps even the world, is indigenous land, and it's valuable to different indigenous groups for material resources and also for cultural reasons. This project looked at CEQA and how the impacts from cannabis cultivation were mitigated by a subset of CEQA, which is called AB 52. So we don't have a lot of time. I could easily spend an hour just on that one line of CEQA, SB 18, AB 52. But basically, CEQA came about in 1970, and it requires developers to look at environmental impacts. SB 18 passed in the early 2000s, I think 2003. And that deals with ancestral remains from Native American groups that were incorporated into CEQA only in 2015 with the passage of AB 52, which is expressly responsible for mitigating impacts to cultural resources. The methods for this project really heavily relied on a tribal advisory board, which was the first step that we took, assembling an advisory committee, working with that committee to develop our research instruments, to introduce us to tribal respondents and representatives, and just help us kind of develop relationships and guide the study. The main work that we did was qualitative. We did interviews, 62 separate interviews with 85 individuals. This was tribal representatives, mostly tribal historic preservation officers, but also cannabis growers, policymakers, county planners, state agencies like the Water Board and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then we went about developing 2 Qualtrics surveys, which we sent out across the state, one expressly for tribes and another for agencies and permitting agencies and planners. So a major problem, or not problem, but caveat of this study is how to conceptualize indigenous land. The panel on the left shows an EPA map of tribal land, which is the federal understanding of tribal land, which is really just the current land holdings that tribes, the land that tribes actually own, right? The actual parcels of ownership. The middle map shows an ethno-linguistic understanding of tribal land ownership, which thinks about Aboriginal territories or ancestral territories. And the rightmost panel is Native Land Digital, which is a not-for-profit, which basically maps indigenous land based on user input. So you can see there's just really quite a wide variety of ways that you can think about California and how tribal land can be assessed. This is important because under AB 52, tribes are responsible not for their current land holdings, but for their Aboriginal territory, for their ancestral land. So if a project is being proposed and that ancestral territory belongs to a certain tribal group, that group would get the notification through the CEQA process, and they would have 30 days of basically to respond to the lead agency to either mitigate or approve the project or not approve the project. What they're approving is the access to tribal cultural resource sites or ancestral sites that are rich in tribal cultural resources. So importantly, what is a tribal cultural resource? The top definition here is directly from AB 52, sites, features, cultural landscapes, valuable to a tribe, but it kind of hinges on whether or not they're within the state register of historic places. And it's not really the definition that tribes themselves choose. When we were presenting at the Tribal EPA conference in November, we asked the audience that we were presenting with what their conception of tribal cultural resources are. And that's where we got this lower list. We got water, salmon, things that are tangible, but then also things like stories and the past and the present, things that are kind of intangible and aren't necessarily easily defined. So really at this juncture, I'll hand it over to Jeremy. And with this sort of background knowledge, our main question was, what are the impacts and what is the sort of the spatial overlap where these impacts might be occurring?
So we really just have time to offer a snapshot of results today. So what are the impacts of cannabis on tribal cultural resources? So unfortunately, one of the first things we found out is that if we're talking that there's a direct coincidence between cannabis cultivation and tribal cultural resources in the state, and we would also assume elsewhere. So if we're talking about a relatively flat parcel of land, southward facing, near a source of water, it turns out that it's not only a good place to grow cannabis, it's also a good place to have a ceremony site or a village site or a gathering ground. In other words, what we can conclude is that cannabis growers are actively selecting for tribal cultural resources when choosing a parcel of land, and this is especially true in the remote regions of the state where cannabis has been grown for decades. So this comes directly out of our surveys. We did, again, one survey with agency representatives, one survey with tribal representatives. We asked both of them, one of our questions, we asked both of them to what extent are counties consulting with tribes. And so it turns out that counties rated themselves better than the tribes did. Possibly no surprise there, but it's so, and the tribal respondents, the results are really split. So some of them seem to be having a good experience, some of them seem to be having not a good experience. But what can we take from this? So one possibility is that counties are over-reporting in the data on their rates and frequency of consultation. Another possibility, and these are not mutually exclusive, is that there's two different definitions of consultation at work. So what is consultation, right? Is it sending a notification to a tribe and then kind of moving on with your project? Or is there something more involved? Spoiler alert, there's something more involved. And so just in summary and to wrap up, one of the major papers that's coming out of this is going to be kind of a sharp focus look at barriers to resource protection. So it's one thing to have AB 52 consultation written into law. It's another thing to protect resources. And so we found that there's still significant barriers. And I highlighted just a few things here. One of them, as we heard in the last presentations, there's a lot of exemptions to CEQA. And if CEQA doesn't happen, AB 52 doesn't go into effect, there is no consultation. So one suggestion might be that there should be a process for protecting cultural resources removed from the CEQA process itself. I mean, I think a lot of people look at this as a positive step. That AB 52 amended CEQA in 2014. However, it is insufficient if there are exemptions to CEQA. Relationships are kind of the je ne sais quoi of policy implementation, we could say. So a lot of these other points actually point back to relationships. So, prior to AB 52 consultation, you didn't actually have longstanding relationships, or because you didn't have opportunities to consult. A lot of tribal governments didn't know their agency counterparts and vice versa. That's all changing, and actually a really nice upside here to to AB 52 consultation is that agencies and tribes are starting to get to know each other. So there's growing pains, but hopefully things are going in the right direction. Another thing, more or less anecdotally, is that there is a ton of turnover in planning offices. Of course, that impacts relationships, that impacts institutional knowledge, that impacts a number of different things. And those impacts impede consultation, they impede resource protection. And then finally, compliance and enforcement. One thing we often heard is that AB 52 has good bones, but no teeth. So in other words, if there are AB 52 violations, that is, counties are not complying with the law, tribes actually have little recourse but to sue, and that's often not a possible or a good solution for tribes. Actually, I just found out yesterday that the first case law is now in motion around AB 52. It's around the Jurassic. Amamutsan has sued County of San Benito over an AB 52 violation. So interesting development there. I hope I haven't gone too far over. This is our contact information. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Herrera, and I'm a community-based cannabis researcher who has been working in the space since harvest season 2009. More recently, I've been working as a grant and loan underwriter, technical assistance provider, and business consultant for cannabis equity programs in Oakland, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and other jurisdictions. I'm also the digital communications specialist supporting the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. The images that I'll be using in this presentation are all generated by cannabis equity advocacy groups or individuals. This particular image is in support of Senate Bill 51, which is just passed through committee, and it allows for retail cannabis license holders that have equity verification to receive provisional licenses that gives them more time to become compliant, receive an annual license, and build their business. My research question focuses on what are the social impacts of cannabis equity programs? And the short answer is we don't know yet. There is an unorganized collection of this data, primarily because it is not required reporting at the local or state level. However, there is a positive trend of self-evaluation internally emerging in local jurisdictions. There are about 15 active programs statewide at different levels of implementation, but they're all operating in a tough environment of pandemic conditions, high local, state, federal taxes and bureaucracy, very aggressive burglaries, and thus high security costs, making it more dangerous and complex to operate a legal cannabis business now versus 5 years ago. Now, 5 years ago, in 2018, when the Cannabis Equity Act established grants from tax revenue to these local equity programs, they had the best intentions to provide startup capital and assistance. But at this point in time, in 2023, in legal cannabis, small farmers and social equity operators are under duress, and they're calling this the drug war 2.0. So we have an opportunity for further evaluation and a deeper analysis of cannabis data. This can better inform policymakers to amend theoretical regulations that aren't working on the ground, to help design or redesign programs with flexibility at the local level, and tease out areas for further investigation. Some of the things we have going for us in studying this topic is a large sample size of equity verified population with thousands of individuals that are recognized at the local and state level as being affected by the war on drugs. And most of them are eager to participate and self-report, but again, at this point, they're experiencing apathy and survey fatigue because little to no action has been taken from their feedback, and the administrative burdens to participate in programs and in cannabis licensing is extremely high. So right now we have some very robust qualitative data. As the other researchers mentioned, we've been engaging with the community, gathering feedback, complaints, ideas, best practices, and documenting the historical trauma and the current regulatory distress. So looking forward, we can identify and tap into new sources of quantitative data that already exist, such as census data, expungement data, the state's track and trace metric software data, point of sale data will have a lot of customer demographics, tax data at the local and state level, and licensing data can show us the social, financial, and political phenomena around bringing equity to cannabis. Oh, and I wanted to bring equity voices to you. So allow me to introduce Miss Ann Jackson.
Cannabis lifted me out of a 33-year-long drug addiction. It brought me home to my kids when all other treatments failed to deliver me from my sickness. I was empowered to heal myself and others. I uncovered my worth in a world that wrote me off as hopeless. My redemption was met with shame. My only natural cure required my freedom as copay. The same country that sold me the illness taxed the medicine. My name is Ann, and I say, pay me in justice.
Ann Jackson is a great example of the value of social equity programs. She's basically the poster child for the City of Oakland's equity program. This image is actually a mural of her that's on the wall on the outside of the Cookies retail dispensary in downtown Oakland. Miss Ann is a survivor of the war on drugs. As she mentions, she credits cannabis as being part of her recovery, and she developed her own line of healing medicinal cannabis products, such as topical salves and lotions, and is now an equity verified entrepreneur, cannabis manufacturer who is transitioning to the licensed market, and the owner of a new shared kitchen space as a recipient of the City of Oakland's property purchase grant. So still looking at the City of Oakland, what we have here is a financial report showing the total gross receipts over 3 years from cannabis equity businesses and general businesses in the City of Oakland. Now we have this data because it became part of the Cannabis Regulatory Commission meeting in September of last year, when the Cannabis Commission Chair, Cheney Turner, requested this data from the Finance Department, and they presented it in the meeting. Now, what if we look to 2022 and the column showing total gross receipts, we see that equity businesses brought in 37 million in total gross receipts last year, and general businesses brought in 207 million. This means that total equity gross receipts were only 18% of the total general gross receipts for 2022. That means, another way of saying this is that general businesses brought in 447% more revenue than equity businesses. To dive a little deeper into this data, we can see these three tables showing the gross receipts by activity or by license type, and it lists in both business categories: retail license, indoor cultivation, outdoor cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and micro business licenses. And if we look again to the right for 2022, we can see that the total number of equity businesses of these combined license types was 115 businesses that brought in the 37 million. And for general businesses, we see a total of 161 businesses that brought in 207 million. And that's not a huge difference in number of businesses, but it's a huge discrepancy in gross receipts for that year. Now, if we jump across the bay to San Francisco, the next equity individual I'd like to bring your attention to is Nina Parks, who is an early initiator of local program evaluation. And here's the flyer that she created. She is a former chair for the San Francisco Cannabis Oversight Committee, a longtime community social justice and cannabis advocate, and a licensed equity verified business owner herself. So we have this preliminary data for the city of San Francisco because Nina and the Human Rights Commission decided to initiate a 5-year review of the San Francisco Cannabis Equity Program. And they approached me to strategize on how to measure the program's rollout and to gather data from the community. So we started small. We sent a short survey to 20 licensed equity owners that we knew would respond and wanted to tell their story. And we got 12 very candid and specific responses back. And it's notable that a few weeks later, the San Francisco Office of Cannabis sent out their own survey separately. Also notable is that unlike Oakland, San Francisco does not have any cannabis tax data because by city ordinance, taxes were suspended for both general and equity businesses until 2026 due to the advocacy of one of their council members. So in this image here, we show a pie chart responding to the question, how long did it take for your business to become licensed and operational in the city of San Francisco? And, you know, since there's only 12 responses, half, which is about 6 people, said that it took longer than 18 months for them to become licensed and operational. Some other responses were over 12 months. We had 3 years. Another response said, my business was unable to secure a license. And another response said that they were working under an MSA, a master service agreement, which generally means that even though this person is in the equity program, they don't own their business. They're being kept on as a consultant or a subject matter expert, but they're not an actual license or business holder. So here I just included some highlights, the barriers and threats to cannabis equity programs. Right now, the barrier to measurement is the uncaptured data due to limited local infrastructure and administrative capacity in both urban cities and rural counties. Often the contractors that they hire to execute these programs can exacerbate disparities and equity issues and add additional a level of bureaucracy with no accountability. A forthcoming threat to the programs is a long existing ban on affirmative action, Prop 209. This is already affecting Humboldt County's equity program because it bars using race, gender, and ethnicity as a factor in not just public university admissions, but state programs. So equity programs that use criteria of zip codes, police beats, or school districts to determine equity status may have to reevaluate their programs. Now, there was an effort to overturn Prop 209, and this would allow state agencies to send the governor a waiver request to avoid some of Prop 209's restrictions, as long as the exception is based on scholarly research. So here is where our efforts in researching this topic could support the programs with this waiver request. So some solutions that I see are to establish a clear criteria for equity verification, to meet those social justice intentions of Prop 64 and the Equity Act. Every jurisdiction has different local criteria for their equity program. But with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development enforcing Prop 209, this strictly prohibits state-funded equity programs from being quote-unquote race-based. So zip codes that are in predominantly Black and Brown communities can't be the basis for participation, and the program would have to show quote-unquote direct impacts as a verification of equity. So the state agencies responsible for regulating cannabis can use scholarly research to show the direct impacts of the war on drugs and we'll start to measure the positive and negative social impacts of existing equity programs so that we can continue to provide this targeted support and funding for communities most harmed by prohibition. Another solution that I have experienced is that increasing funding and stabilizing the timing of the funding to local equity programs would really help to maintain the positive momentum that they're building in their current programs and help them scale up as their markets grow. Also, smaller jurisdictions do not have the administrative capacity or the extra funding to match state funds for their programs. So this requirement might force smaller jurisdictions to close down due to their inability to meet those requirements to receive state funds. So I'm happy to answer questions and share these images. Thank you for your time.
So now we'll have a little Q&A from the Zoom attendees and also in-person attendees.
I had a question for the folks who did the analysis of local regulations. So you noted that Humboldt had the most permits that were fully processed, whereas the other counties sort of lagged. I wonder if you could put those numbers into context of the number of applicants. So how many applicants are still in process, how many were submitted, et cetera, to really better contextualize those numbers. Do you have those data as well?
We do have sort of rough estimates for the different jurisdictions that jurisdictions have provided us in terms of what their pipeline might look like. That was not necessarily a main goal of this particular research, just because of our scope. We were looking at approvals, but it's off the on my feet. It's difficult to sort of contextualize those numbers now. But I will say, we have sort of during the data collection process, we've identified many projects that are within the pipeline but haven't reached this level of final approval. Like, to use Monterey, for example, we're only saying 4, but we've actually identified probably 5 times that number of projects that are still in the pipeline but haven't managed to get every single one of the local approvals that's needed. So our focus, our scope is on what projects have successfully gotten through. But of course, within that scope, we are not necessarily capturing the full universe of people who are stuck in the local process.
So another question for this group, again, about Humboldt, just because the numbers are really interesting. So like, how do you get the most approvals and take the longest? Do you start earlier, or what's going on? How does it work?
That is a good question. And so this sort of speaks to what Haley and Joanna said about the heterogeneity of this actual local systems, right? So in Humboldt in particular, you kind of have to look at the larger context. So in order to receive that pre-existing status, right, you had to have had all your paperwork in at the end of 2016. So of course, in a place like Humboldt, you have your applicant pool upfront, right? So that's part of the reason why you're seeing 800, 900-day approvals, because you had to have everything in, and now everybody is competing to get through the process, right? Whereas in other jurisdictions where you don't have this very pronounced distinction between pre-existing and new, and where you just don't have the number of applicants to begin with, it's more of sort of a gradual trickle of applicants coming in over time. So it is definitely, that's one of the hardest things about this particular project, is how do you build functional equivalencies across all of these jurisdictions that are using very different systems, and systems that have changed just in the 2 years that we're studying them, right? So that's been one of the challenges that we've faced over the last 2 years. And in the final report, we do hope to sort of contextualize all that a little more. But that, just to use Humboldt as example, that's sort of probably why you see that happening.
Yeah, I had a question around the cultural resources project, and wondering if you can speak to any examples of what came from consultation. Were there conditions added to permits? Were there projects that were denied? I know that specifically Humboldt County has a special provision that actually, as I understand it, allows tribes there to have a very meaningful engagement in, the yay or nay on projects. But I'm just wondering more broadly, how does it matter if you have AB 52 consultation?
Yes. So, I mean, a couple things come to mind. So we didn't actually develop any specific case studies, but, we interviewed quite a few people, including growers who had their, I talked to a couple of people in Humboldt who had their projects stopped. And I think that's what you're referring to, that the Humboldt County, policy and procedure actually empowers the tribe to stop a project. And a lot of tribes are advocating for that level of decision-making authority. That is not how it's working across the rest of the state. The language of AB 52 used the language of discretionary agency discretion. So agencies preserve discretion. Of course, if a tribe disagrees with an agency's determination, so in other words, the agency determines at the end of the day whether, and through consultation, listen to the tribe, and then they determine whether it's a tribal cultural resource or not, if the TCR is not listed with a local or national register. That level of agency discretion doesn't work in the favor of tribes much of the time. And so then tribes in that case, would have no other recourse but to litigate if they disagreed and they wanted to protect that resource. But yeah, so I mean, in terms of what's happening, on a county by county basis, it's hard to sum it all up. I mean, there's a lot of variation across counties. And there was something else that you brought to mind, but did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just a quick addition would just be, through our interview process, we spoke to a number of tribal representatives who basically expressed that had they not been consulted, the development project would have gone through. And it might be an acre or just even a piece of a creek or a certain rock that's important to the tribe. And if they're not consulted meaningfully, again, like more than just a piece of paper consultation, but there's actually a relationship that's built, then these development projects end up going through. And there's really no recourse after that. Once the cultural site has been damaged, there's nothing that can be done. And so the whole idea behind the law is to really mitigate impacts or before they occur. And this San Benito case that's happening right now is really interesting. It doesn't have anything to do with cannabis, but again, it's basically like a strip mall that they want to put in on the side of the road. A developer has been trying to make this happen for years, and the tribe hasn't been meaningfully consulted by the county of San Benito. And so now this is the first case that's actually going to go to court over AB 52 violations. So I think it can be really meaningful and really can be really impactful. But like Jeremy said in his presentation, we heard that a number of times, good bones, no teeth, just that without any kind of case law and without any sort of challenges in court, AB 52, it really is open to interpretation. So
I guess my specific question was whether there were, from your interviews, you heard of positive examples where the tribal TIBO was able to raise a concern and then have it addressed in the permitting, so that it was a win-win where the project could go forward but avoid the impact, whether or not it was like sort of legally mandated, whether the county would use their discretion in a positive way, whether there are at least some examples of that happening or not.
There were some.
There definitely are. And I think it really depends. I mean, you can talk to some TIPOs. So the TIPO for Great and Rancheria, for example, in Sonoma County has had really good, would tell you that they've had really good consultations and really good outcomes specifically around cannabis permitting. And I think, in Humboldt, it's actually a little bit of a mixed bag, but I think they've had a largely positive experience as well. I think another important, other places they're not, and then it's also important to distinguish between federated tribes and non-federally recognized tribes. A couple people we talked to in Santa Barbara complained that basically the county just goes to Santa Ynez, and doesn't even, and kind of treats Santa Ynez as the figurehead of all the tribes in the region, doesn't even bother to notify some of the non-federally recognized tribes. So yeah, variation. And I think one other thing really worth emphasizing is that mitigation doesn't necessarily mean that the project can't go forward, right? And I think that's a common misconception that really needs to be dispelled. it's often not that the tribe doesn't want any kind of development. Often they have, and it really depends on what kind of tribal cultural resources there. But we've heard a lot of different things. I mean, sometimes, Karuk doesn't want ground disturbance. That's, kind of their tribal protocol, no ground disturbance. So they don't even want surveys and archaeologists who are doing this work to dig in order to determine what kinds of resources are there. And then you have other, and then we've also heard other things where they're a creative mitigation. So there's a category of creative mitigations, and sometimes there can be monetary compensation. Sometimes there can be investments in scholarships or land trusts or something like that. That would be compensatory, right, for a tribe. Other times there's, I think anecdotally we did hear about some really nice solutions where if you just move the water tank a little bit, you can build the facility, but it was just a question of like what's put where or something like that, or maybe pave over the ground because there's a grave site underneath, something like that. And then the tribe will offer its approval of the project.
I actually had a question for you guys, but I just had one quick more question for you guys about the tribal sovereignty work. Was just wondering if with AB 52, did that provide any funding to tribes to be able to increase staffing capacity for their TIPOs or anything like that?
That's what created the TIPO program. Actually, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer program came out of AB 52. So that's what funds tribes. That's federal funding, but it goes to tribes through AB 52 through the state. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then I had a quick question for you folks doing the local regs work. I was just wondering, like, I know you discussed some of the kind of details of why the process could take longer for existing cultivators in Humboldt, but I was curious if you had also looked at any differences in site characteristics between the actual farms where these folks that are coming in who were not existing cultivators, like where they're putting those farms relative to where some of these pre-existing cultivators were.
Yes, that's sort of the next several weeks of my life is taking the data that we have now that all the data has been assembled, cutting the data in different ways to sort of evaluate how do these quantitative metrics line up with some of the qualitative characteristics that we know about the projects from their approval documents. So we want to look at that. Don't have the numbers for you today, though.
My question is actually for you, Laura. So related to data and ownership in the cannabis industry, my understanding is prior to 2018, most businesses were actually owned by people of color and were structured in a very cottage industry kind of way, especially manufacturing. Is there a way to generate a year-on-year or a comparison that you're aware of, or how might we go about measuring changes in equity over time?
I've thought about that a lot. So during Prop 215 times, those businesses were paying taxes. So I'm interested in looking at tax data from before Prop 64. And it seems logical that we could look at the tax data from those businesses. Moving forward, in terms of ownership, in most of the cities that I've worked with, Oakland, Sacramento, Los Angeles, they are tracking like ownership percentages. I don't know if every jurisdiction is capturing the ethnic or racial backgrounds of the owners. In Oakland, they are. And actually, I don't know that most businesses were owned by people of color before Prop 64. I think it's always been mostly Anglo-white ownership of cannabis businesses. I've seen some arrest reports from Oakland in 2017 that said, even though in 2017, cannabis was widely accepted and decriminalized, the arrest rates for the Black population in Oakland were still tremendously high. So that tells us that even though cannabis businesses were operating under medical licenses, and you think of the comfort with which people just kind of openly smoke cannabis at parks and stuff like that, you wouldn't expect to see such high arrest rates. So yeah, I would say that
it's probably always been a majority white ownership for cannabis businesses. And that remains true today.
Hi, this is Claudia with Caliwano. Can you talk on the 19 million that the state gave to the grant programs and how that actually came to be and if there's going to be more money coming?
So from my understanding, cannabis tax revenues are reviewed by the legislature, and then they allocate a certain amount to GoBiz to distribute to the programs that have been that are running local equity programs or intend to run local equity programs. The way that that money is calculated is not transparent. We don't know how the legislature is calculating the amount of money that it's putting back into equity programs. Hopefully we'll get more transparency from that on the future. And even though there is like a feedback loop of reporting where social equity programs that receive state funds have to report back to GoBiz, it's not robust is what I'd say. It's kind of bare minimum reporting. Here's how many participants we had. Here's how much money was spent. They do go through the process of making sure that all of those equity programs are serving participants that have that verification. But there's just a lot of uncaptured data, as I mentioned, and the rigorous data collection and analyzation and aggregating and cleanup that team is doing is probably going to be a useful model for us to start measuring social equity. So somebody, a Zoom attendee said, as of this week, Trinity County has 198 fully processed CEQA compliant local permits ready for state annual licenses. So yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Last comments? We'll get one from Alicia.
And this question is for Laura. As an equity person in business in Oakland, what do you think we can do to help basically everything that you said about equity and the drug war 2.0 based on your work?
Well, the pressure to measure these programs is coming from the participants, from advocacy groups, and just the local jurisdictions realizing that they're not capturing what's happening in their programs. The money's going out, but they're not really measuring how effective it is and how many businesses it's helping, how many people succeeded from the application process to getting a license and having an operating business. None of that information is being captured right now. So that's kind of the first step. And advocates and business folks such as yourself putting pressure on the local jurisdictions to show that data is what's going to move the dial. And I think it's also just going to become a requirement eventually, because as we get more sophisticated in our analysis of the money that's spent on cannabis programs and the number of licenses that are being approved, et cetera, data science is just going to become a bigger piece of California looking at its cannabis laws and the money that the state puts to programs and licensing, et cetera. Well, with that, I think we might be done with our presentation part. Any last thoughts, questions, or comments? Anything happening? Oh yeah, I just included this so that we could look at what we're going to be researching in the future. A lot of these projects, the tribal project, for example, will be hosting a webinar tomorrow on Zoom so that we can continue the conversation about the tribes and government agencies continuing their conversation. So a lot of our work will continue, but these are the official DCC grants that we got for 2023. And so we'll continue to pursue our investigations, but these are the specific grants that are funded by the state, and we'll be presenting on those next year, I guess. Any final words from the directors?
I'll see you all outside for a beer or a glass of wine. And this is the important part of the important part of the evening where we get to really learn from the people in the room. And, you know, we love your feedback. We love to hear what's going on in the cannabis world. So please stick around and let's have a good conversation.